afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Creature Research series. I'm Wessie Ling, Professor of Transcultural Arts and Design from the School of Art, Architecture and Design, and the Director of Creature. We are delighted to co-host this seminar with the Center for Global Diversities and Inequalities. Here we have Professor Louise Ryan, Director of the Center. Today, together, we will moderate this session, and a warm welcome to all of you. Please be reminded that we are recording the session. You will find the recording following today's event on our Creature website. We ask the audience to mute yourself and switch off your camera to avoid interference with the signal. The chat box is not working due to a technical error, unfortunately, so please reserve your questions for the Q&A time towards the end of the session. The Transcultural Exchanges and Network research strand of Creature convenes Reorienting Cultural Creativity, a research series on the tactics of resistance in institutionalized establishments and post-colonial processes of globalization, in an attempt to add new prospects and visions to the existing setup of art and culture. The series readdresses the balance for an actor-oriented approach. The research series brings together art, design, cultural historians, curators, artists and researchers in the humanities whose work concerns art and culture, mythology, and the cultural and creative industry in asymmetric societies of post-coloniality. Today, our seminar on economic femininity and gender violence brings together Professor Kate Maclean at Northumbria University and Dr. Maria López at London Metropolitan University. We will begin the session with Professor Maclean, followed by Dr. López. Professor Ryan and I will then moderate the questions from the audience. Kate Maclean is Professor of International Development at Northumbria University. She has worked on urban violence and governance in Colombia, rural development in Bolivia, informal markets, gender and finance, and the middle classes and urbanization in the Global South. Her latest project was on the rise of the Amarant bourgeoisie in López, Bolivia, and was funded by the Leverhulme Trust. Her presentation today is Conspicuous Consumption and Aiding the Economic Femininity, Cholap Senior Fashions in Bolivia. Dr. Maria López is a reader at the School of Social Sciences, London Metropolitan University. She is the course leader for the Master in Political Violence and Radicalization Studies. She's a visiting fellow at the Latin American and Caribbean Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Security, Intelligence and Governance at Instituto Tecnológico Automotor de Mexico. You can see how bad my Spanish is, so please excuse me. She is also a member of Tunis's Publishing House editorial board for Latin American Social Science Studies. She will present political violence against women in Latin America after Professor Maclean. Now, without further ado, I hand over to Professor Maclean now for her presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Wessie. I'm going to rely on Hannah to move my slides along. So I'm going to be doing a Chris Whitty impression, I think, with the next slide, please. But before I start, I really do want to say how pleased I am to be here. I think this series sounds absolutely fantastic, and I was particularly taken with the importance of bringing together the cultural and creative industries with the discussion of global inequality and also with violence. Wessie, in her introduction there, mentioned that I have worked on urban violence in Colombia. I don't think you knew, though, Wessie, that I've also done a little bit of work in Juarez in Mexico, which I know is Maria's focus. And when I teach gender geographies, globalization, and how that relates to violence, I actually use Maria's piece on the LSE website to introduce Juarez and the relevance of value and modernity and the gendered construction of value and modernity to violence. Now, I worked in Juarez, that was maybe 15 years ago. It was before I even started my PhD. But when I came to look at what might look like the completely different subject of Cholap Senior Fashions, it was actually the framing of value and modernity that I'd learned reading about Juarez that brought me to analysis that I make I'm still working on, actually. So I'm really delighted to be on a panel with Maria, and I think it's quite insightful, because I reread my article to double check I hadn't referenced Juarez, actually, because it was so clearly in my mind when I wrote it, but obviously tangential. So I think, Wessie, it was quite insightful for you to bring us both together in that, because again, I don't think you could have known that there was that connection. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Now, as Wessie was saying, I did a Liebe project on the rise of the Aymara bourgeoisie in La Paz. Aymara is the largest indigenous group in Bolivia. I'll be giving some more detail on that as we go through. Now, by trade, I'd call myself a feminist geographer. And I came to the question of the rise of the Aymara bourgeoisie, and then consequent to that, the importance of fashion, from my interests in urban change with the development of the middle classes in the global south, and also my interests in economic femininity and financial femininity, and the way that different gendered subjectivities are emerging in that context of the rise of the middle class in the global south. But when I was invited to contribute to a special issue in the International Journal of Cultural Studies, that's when I first encountered fashion theory. And when I revisited that paper to prepare this presentation, I think the work in decolonization and fashion theory that draws specifically on Latin American theorizations of modernity and coloniality is absolutely fascinating. And I'm really excited to learn more about that, again, hopefully in the discussion afterwards, because as I said, this was my first foray into fashion theory. Okay. So what I'll be going through today is what meanings we can attribute to the rise of Cholap Senior Fashions, La Mode de la Cholap Senior. In the image there, you've got the cityscape of La Paz with Illimani in the background, and a dancer in one of the fiestas silhouetted there. She's wearing the traditional poietta outfit, which, Hannah, if we can have the next slide, which is very difficult to describe without using that word traditional, as I just did, actually. So I thought I'd start by introducing what La Cholap Senior is, and what the importance of that outfit is to understanding the kind of cultural landscape and the importance of clothing in Bolivia. Yeah. So La Cholap Senior is an indigenous woman who works in urban markets. So indigeneity is often associated with rurality. Certainly in Bolivia, there's a significant imbrication between rurality, being a peasant, and being indigenous. However, the figure of La Cholap Senior has been a powerful figure for centuries. She is a woman who negotiates rural production and urban markets, and was, in order to fulfill that role, took on the outfit of the poietta. Now, the poietta, I'll be showing you better photos in a second, but if you look at the big skirts that you can see in the cover of this book, that's the poietta, the multiple skirts. So it looks kind of Spanish, like old-fashioned Spanish, and indeed that was a Spanish outfit that indigenous women were placed in during colonial times, and adopted to perform more effectively in markets. However, it's also the outfit that's worn by indigenous peasant women as well. And the more luxurious the poietta, the more likely you are to be in contact with urban markets as well. But principally, to be de poietta is more than just an outfit. It's a clear identity. And I think when I've been reading about fashion theory, that can get called anti-fashion. The closer that clothing is to identity, ethnicity, and tradition, then it's almost the opposite of fashion. So that's part of the transition that I'm very interested in tracing. But to be de poietta is a powerful political identity in Bolivia. And so social movements will define themselves as being about women de poietta. And that means indigenous women and indigenous women who own their culture. And that includes indigenous women who are living in rural areas, and also La Cholap Senior, the more urban It's kind of an in-between cultural ethnic category. So a woman who can negotiate rural communities, but also highly competitive urban markets. And so for centuries, La Chola has been a powerful economic figure. And that's part of the, so that kind of bringing together of culture and economy is important throughout. The reason the poietta is such an important identity is because it is a form of resistance, to read out this quote, a form of resistance to the discrimination and homogenization of mestizaje with all the complexity that that implies. So with attempts to modernize Bolivia and attempts to bring, since the 1950s, a similar story across the world, with attempts to bring a modern citizenship to Bolivia, there's been an erasure of difference and an attempt to impose a certain kind of Western, in a word-based citizenship. And to be de poietta is a reaction to that. Yeah. So that's the strength of the political identity behind the poietta. Yeah. Can we have the next slide? You may have come across the poietta, even if you've never been to Bolivia. That was the theoretical background to the poietta there, but it's got to me, I think, a surprising amount of coverage in the UK press as well. This is from 2014. This is actually when I first became interested in the rise of the indigenous bourgeoisie in Bolivia. It was covered in the Financial Times. And the headline there says, Bolivia's indigenous people flaunt their newfound wealth. And this article was talking about the remarkable economic boom that there's been in Bolivia and how that's accumulated in indigenous markets, informal markets, and that therefore there is now conspicuous consumption, particularly in the form of architecture, fiestas, and also fashion. And it's the Financial Times. That's an economic vision of what's going on in Bolivia. There has indeed been a tripling of GDP in Bolivia since 2006. And a lot of that wealth has accumulated for various reasons, which I'll go into in informal markets. But I'm not convinced that conspicuous consumption and the idea that now we're getting a kind of economic femininity that is less political and is more about consuming. I'm not convinced that that's what's going on in Bolivia. Can we have the next slide? You may also have come across the poietta. This is perhaps a clearer indication of what the outfit looks like. One of Bolivia's top fashion designers, Elena Pereiras, showed her collection in New York in 2016. This was at the invitation of the Spanish designer Agatha Ruiz de la Prada. And I think that this representation in National Geographic, it's remarkable that, well, one might have expected a fashion show to be covered in Cosmopolitan or Vogue, but this show was particularly covered in National Geographic, which suggests that maybe the rise of indigenous fashion is maintaining an association with tradition, with ethnicity, with places that are somehow elsewhere. But I'm not convinced that's the whole story either. It's an element of the story, and as an element of in maintaining the political identity of the poietta, that when facing the outside world, there's a certain level of self-exoticization that's going on. But I'm not convinced that's the whole story either, but that's the coverage that it's got in the international press. I think that's what's going on in Bolivia for quite specific reasons. It's maybe slightly different to the way that we're seeing a disruption of the binaries between tradition and fashion elsewhere in the world. So can we have the next slide? This was my first encounter with the rise of Cholap Senior Fashions in Bolivia, and this was the fashion parade of the Cholap Senior in August 2016. There's been a fashion parade in La Paz of Cholap Senior Fashions for a good 15-20 years, and there have been beauty contests of the Cholap Senior. However, with the economic boom, this has taken on a different level. Yeah. So this really was a big televised show. It was held in the Bolivian embassy, sorry, the Brazilian embassy. The wife of the Brazilian ambassador was particularly taken with these fashion designs, and she would make a point of, she would make a trip up to the area where these designs are made in order to buy jewellery and stuff like that. So she curated this. She put on this fashion show together with the city, with La Paz city. The Cholap Senior has always been a symbol of La Paz, and it's really prominent in their city branding, basically in their tourist literature. Yeah. And this show was the first to feature international designers, Bolivian designers, but those that had shown internationally, and and the value of the clothes on show was significantly higher than they had been in previous years. So in the outfit that you can see here, the shawl, for example, is made of vicuña, which is a very fine form of alpaca. It's a llama alpaca, smaller alpaca basically, but it's particularly fine wool. And that shawl was worth, it was being sold for $20,000. Yeah. So it's the market has changed for the fashions of the Cholap Senior. And the next slide, please. Here's another outfit, similar quality of materials and similar expense. And the next slide. And this was the mayor of La Paz who was there as well. I think this is another, in order to describe perhaps what's an element of what's going on, but what's not the whole story. The mayor of La Paz was involved in organising that fashion show, central to La Paz's city branding. The tradition of the Cholap Senior is foregrounded. This is his wife, who's a beauty queen from Santa Cruz, which Santa Cruz is one of the wealthier cities in La Paz. And it's a city that sees itself as one of the whiter cities in La Paz. Bolivia's beauty queens traditionally come from Santa Cruz. There have been various incidents where beauty queens from Santa Cruz have taken pains to point out that Santa Cruz is a different kind of city to the rest of Bolivia. It's therefore quite remarkable that the wife of the mayor chose to come dressed as a Cholap Senior. Yeah. She is wearing that as costume. Yeah. So it's not she's not wearing it. It's not being integrated as fashion. Yeah. It's also not quite co-optation. I was on one. I'm aware that in the States there are Chola fashions, which is more co-optation of a Hispanic, predominantly Mexican fashion, quite an urban chic, that's being integrated into mainstream fashion and co-opted in some ways. That's not what's going on either. It's also not quite favela chic. I was on a panel with a Brazilian anthropologist who was making a comparison between what was going on in Bolivia in terms of the development of the fashion industry there and what's going on in Brazil, where you tend to get traditional established Brazilian fashion designers taking trends from favelas, which are cool, and integrating them into mainstream fashion. There's kind of an iterative process there. That's not what's going on in Bolivia. This is an element, it's not really co-optation, this is an element of costume that's involved in beauty queens from Santa Cruz wearing the poietta. But nevertheless, the poietta used to be illegal in public spaces in La Paz right up until 1952, and the revolution in 1952. So it's a remarkable shift in the socioeconomic hierarchies that this should happen. Yeah. Next slide. There's also, going back to the Financial Times and their analysis, there is an element of the rise in the middle class and consumption power, basically, in indigenous informal areas of cities in Bolivia that mean that there's a market there for fashion to be sold to. And this is a photograph of a market area, quite a wealthy area in a peri-urban informal settlement in El Alto, which is just outside La Paz. And you can see there that the Spanish company Menaco is advertising to La Cholap Senior. They've got a collection of shoes, a collection of shoes, those particular sandals that are worn, that are marketed towards the Cholas who have newfound wealth, exactly as the article in the Financial Times was saying. That image, I think, kind of reproduces the image of the middle class consumer, which is quite disruptive in itself. The way that the fashion industry is often analysed is that you have the Western middle class consumer, and that's the economic femininity that is associated with fashion, urbanity, the developed world. And so it's a transgression in itself that this is now being represented as an Indigenous woman. However, the reason they're doing that is that they will have seen on a spreadsheet, that's what's going on in Bolivia. There is now the consumption power, growing middle class. There is a market for our product. However, they're not really capturing the kind of economic femininity that is emerging from the rise of Cholap fashions Aymaran fashions in Bolivia, and that particular economic femininity that's being produced. What I'd suggest is that the poietta specifically is being recreated as part of the fabric of a particular kind of economy. It's maintaining its position within the culture, the cultural exchanges which underpin the rise of the Aymara bourgeoisie. And as such, it's much more than just a consumer item. Yeah. So it's maintaining its importance as a marker of value is beyond that of just a consumption item. Yeah. And to maybe illustrate the different kinds of femininity that are emerging, can I have the next slide? Hannah, can I have the next slide? Yeah. This was the first model to come out at that fashion show. So I think maybe the first images I showed you there were traditional models. There were professional models, professionally made up. It's a very professional show. But the first women to come out weren't professional fashion models. This is a member of the group Las Escaleras, the mountain climbers, and they're a group of Aymaran women who have climbed Bolivia's peaks. It's an Andean country; it has big mountains. They've climbed mountains dressed in the poietta, yeah? And that's to indicate not only the political identity of the that goes along with the poietta, but also the kind of femininity that goes along with the poietta. Women de poietta are known as being savvy market women, hardworking, and they don't associate with that quite passive kind of femininity that is the middle class consumer. And the fact that that fashion show opened with one of Las Escaleras dressed de poietta, but also in mountain gear, is doubly disruptive of the ideas of both femininity and indigeneity that go along with the story of how fashion is produced and consumed. So that's my proposition, is that what's going on in Bolivia, for quite specific reasons that I'm going to go into now, disrupts the story that we tell about fashion, the stories of the oppressed third world worker, the middle class consumer in the global north, and also the waiting to be disrupted binary between tradition and modernity. There's something far more complicated going on here. And I think that is intimately connected with the way that Bolivia has developed over this period of economic boom that really started in 2006. So I'm going to go into the background of that economic boom, because I think it's important to understand how the poietta is understood economically as well as a fashion, and to place it properly as a fashion item. Yeah. So can we go to the next slide? The key year, 2006, that's when Eva Morales was inaugurated as the first, arguably, the first Indigenous president of Bolivia. Yeah. I've written, the jumper he's wearing is very interesting as well. I've actually written an article about his jumper too, in a very different context, but I could go on at length about the significance of the jumper that he wears often. This was from the first year he was elected president, and you can see there that he has support from Indigenous women de poietta, as well as las cholas paseñas as well, all of whom wear this outfit of the derby hat, the shawl, and the long skirt. Yeah. Now, Eva Morales was elected on a platform of decolonization and of post-neoliberalism. So decolonization, depatriarchalization, and also plurality were at front and center of his electoral strategy, and also they are the opening articles of Bolivia's new constitution, which came in a few years after the inauguration. But the vision of plurality is a world where many worlds fit. And very interestingly, cultural plurality, you might expect, cultural plurality is recognised in Eva Morales' platform and in the new constitution, but also economic plurality is emphasised, and that's a reaction against neoliberalism. That's a reaction against the idea of a falsely neutral homo economicus who's competitive, who's the liberal individualist ideas that underpinned the world's harshest neoliberal structural adjustment program, which took place in Bolivia in the 1980s and really ravaged the social fabric of Bolivia. I don't think that's too controversial to say that. It produced incredible levels of inequality, and indigenous people were particularly at the wrong end of that restructuring. So when Eva Morales was elected, cultural plurality wasn't just about recognition of different languages. It wasn't about a kind of a multiculturalism that you could also associate with like fashion and kind of artisan items from indigenous peoples. That could be part of a neoliberal multiculturalism, a market multiculturalism rather than neoliberal, that valued culture for its value as a consumption item, for its market value. What was the explicit aim of the Mas and Eva Morales was to bring that cultural diversity into dialogue with the underpinning economic structures, because they recognized that cultural identity and the reciprocity, gift-giving, trust that are essential to economic activity can't be understood without culture. And the rise of poietta fashions, of Cholap Senior Fashions, comes from that, which is why it sits in a very interesting way. Like it disrupts rather our ideas of economic subjectivity and those very problematic binaries between tradition, modernity, use value, consumption value. Quite intentionally, the plan was to disrupt those binaries, and poietta fashions have come out of that. Yeah. Not unproblematically, though, as I go on to say, but the boom in Bolivia's GDP coincided, and it wasn't a coincidence rather than by design, it coincided with Evo Morales' administration. So there was a natural resource boom on the global markets that started in 2006, and from 2006 to 2014, Bolivia's GDP boomed. And that wealth, the tripling of economic production, because of explicit mechanisms that wanted to reverse the colonial, patriarchal and false neutrality of liberal policies that had meant that the traditional elites got the lion's share of the economy. Specific policies to reverse that meant that that wealth ended up with Evo Morales' power base. Indigenous people working predominantly in either rural areas or informal markets. And that's the nuts and bolts, again, back to the Financial Times. That would be an orthodox economist explanation of what's happened with these specific policies that have meant that there was an economic boom that accumulated in the hands of Indigenous people working in the informal market. Yeah. Can we go to the next slide? Now, Bolivia has a massive informal market, which is the other element of this story. Now, I hope you can see me. When I say informal, I'm putting quote marks around it. So informal sector, as I'm about to explain, is quite a problematic term. But to clarify the economic mechanisms behind it, Bolivia has the largest informal economy in the world, over 50%. Yeah, some estimates it's over 60%. So you can imagine informality is quite difficult to quantify. The question that begs, however, is if over 50% of Bolivia's economy is informal, what does informal actually mean? And certainly what does formal mean in that context? So that's why this division between formality and informality is quite problematic. It can be used as a shorthand for the kind of scene that you see here. This is an area of La Paz where you buy different kinds of clothes. A lot of clothing is imported from China and South Korea. That's increased exponentially, which is an important element of this story as well. That's increased exponentially since 2006, as have used clothes predominantly from the United States. And it's not, they've come in as contraband, so import tax isn't paid. These market areas, they don't tend to pay tax. Not exactly because they're dodging it. It's more that the formal sector isn't established, like the informality is defined as not paying tax, but it's more that the formal sector hasn't established itself as sufficiently to be able to collect those taxes. You can see there that there's it's not very health and safety. There's a lack of regulation of the space as well, the wires, the fact that they're able to sell on the street, and that's been one of the aims of the mass of Eva Morales' party, has been to increase formality and increase the tax base. But nevertheless, politically, they've been very reliant on that. That's their electoral support, is these informal markets. The size of Bolivia's informal economy means most people are working in the informal economy. That does not mean that they're involved in illicit economies. I'm more than happy to answer questions about the association between informal economies and illicit, particularly coca-related economies in Bolivia. They're not coextensive by any stretch of the imagination. It's perfectly possible to earn a living in the informal markets of Bolivia without being involved in anything illicit at all. Yeah. However, there is an interface there. It's also not coextensive with poverty. There has always been wealth in informal markets, and that's a challenge for development economists, a long-standing challenge for development economists, is how to bring the wealth of informal markets into the national purse. Yeah. So to some extent, it could be seen as a surprise that there's now enough wealth in these areas to buy a $20,000 vicuña shawl, but it's been a long time coming. It's not been a huge switch. They've managed to benefit from the economic boom, but there are tropes that can be drawn on, as well as economic currents, to explain that. However, it does highlight that the informality, the rise of these fashions does highlight that informality is a category of absence. There is no informality unless there is a formal, also colonial, system of governance there to show up the informal, and you're kind of blinded to what's there already, which I think is part of why the articles in the Financial Times, National Geographic, that's the surprise and the slight exoticization that comes along with the development of these fashions, is that they come from the informal markets. Yeah. However, it's not unproblematic, including for the clothing and fashion industry, that wealth has accumulated in the informal sector. Can we go to the next slide? So this is the protest leaflet, an information protest leaflet from the formal clothing sector in Bolivia that has seen a sharp decline since 2006. Bolivia did actually have quite a strong textiles and particularly llama leather industry in the 1970s that was adversely affected by structural adjustment in the 1980s and the various global developments in the textiles industry, and has been really in decline ever since. When greater regulation of the formal sector came in, including higher taxes with Eva Morales' government, those in the formal sector who had to obey those regulations to maintain formality really did have trouble meeting, for example, higher minimum wage in the face of global competition. They didn't have flexibility. They did have higher taxes that they were targeted for tax collection as well, for political reasons, I think it's fair to say, and they were feeling the pinch. Their argument is that although the informal economy, which includes not only the fashions that I've just showed you, that's the kind of the cradle of the fashions that I was showing is the informal economy, but also the influx of imports from China, from Korea, from the US in the form of used clothes, that had really decimated Bolivian production, and they were providing jobs. Yeah. And if they go under, the jobs go under. So they had valid points to make. However, the way they chose to represent their protests against what was going on was to show a white guy in a suit being crucified, yeah, which highlights the cultural and political nature of that formal-informal divide. And that's exactly what their argument as well is, that the informal sector, the reason all that wealth has has landed with Indigenous people working in the informal sector is, to use their word, corruption. Yeah? And there have been instances where it's clear that certain businesses it's not being insisted on that they pay tax in the way that the businesses of the traditional middle class are being pursued for tax. And there are instances of favoritism, basically, for those political reasons as part of a post-neoliberal decolonial aim of the government. However, it's unfortunate and somewhat crass to represent it in this way, but it also underlines the importance of fashion in terms of identity and representation, but also in economic terms, representing that formal-informal divide. However, what the fashions of the Cholap Senior do is represent a different form of economy that is not accurately represented by this distinction between formality and informality. Can we go to the next slide? So the preferred term is popular economies. The idea of a popular economy makes clear that what is there isn't what is in these informal areas, where there are now successful fashion businesses, isn't informality. It's not which is a lack of formality, but rather what is there is a community economy, a popular economy. Yeah? And it's an economy that's built up on community ties that are bound together by traditions, as they always are. That example of the soup kind of highlights that developed and formal economies are as bound together by traditions as well. So there's the binary itself is just unhelpful. Yeah? But the community ties that have gained traction and gained wealth over the last 15 years are underpinned by the fiesta, which is underpinned by the poietta as well. So the poietta represents the reciprocal traditions of the fiesta and of the identity that underpins the trust relationships on which economies are built. So the way fiestas work, they have their own economy as well. The fiestas have agricultural roots and rural traditions, and it's an honor in the rural community to become preste, to be the person who's putting on the fiesta. But the way that you develop your role as preste is that you build up loans over the years to other people who are organizing fiestas. And so you'd lend somebody money for the band, or you'd lend somebody money for the outfits. And then when it's your turn to organize everything, that person will return the favor and lend you money. Yeah? And so there's a whole financial system that, again, is underpinned by the tradition of the fiesta. Yeah? You can become godmother of the hats, for example. So that's the compadrazgo traditions around the fiesta. If you're the sponsor, if you like, it's called festive sponsorship. If you're the sponsor of the hats or the outfits or the rattles or the food or the drinks, then you're contributing financially. So that is, it's interesting to trace the different ways that fiestas take place and how they're becoming, how they are that confluence of commercial economic exchanges with reciprocal gift exchanges, and the way they're meeting together, and the different identities that go along with those reciprocal exchanges. In rural areas, there's an insistence that nothing should be bought in the fiesta. It has to be all on a sharing economy. In that way, it's all about who the tradition's called Aini. It's all about reciprocal traditions. In more urban areas, people from the countryside will say, oh, it's not like it used to be, because now it's all commercial. Everyone's making a profit. And so the social relations are changing with a more commercial economy that comes in. Yeah. However, the mass aim, and this draws very specifically on Latin American decolonial theory, the mass aim is to create a pluri-economy, an economy where many economies fit. And so there's been an explicit valuing of those community exchanges and the traditions and the identities behind them, which are personified in the poietta. Now that's the people who put together the leaflet about the decline of the formal enterprise in Bolivia would probably roll their eyes at me saying that this is a community economy, and they would want to call it corruption. And they're not entirely wrong. There is an interface there, is it? And that's a theoretical question as well, where particularist favouring of communities and the particularist exchanges becomes favoritism rather than valuing a certain kind of community. But the counter argument to that, represented very clearly with the guy in the suit being crucified, is that the false neutrality of the formal liberal individualist ideas of economy is that actually there was always an implicit favouring of a more Western culture, an individualist liberal culture. So that's the economy that's going on underneath this rise of the poietta fashions. And again, it disrupts that division between use value and commercial value. Can we go to the next slide? Now, the main fiesta in La Paz, I don't think it's going ahead this year, but the main fiesta is on the 10th of June, and that's Gran Poder. Gran Poder is taking over of the center of La Paz with folkloric dances, the majority of which tend to be La Morenada, which involves wearing as costume the poietta. And you can see that in the image there. It's quite a triumphant parade because the poietta used to be banned in public spaces in La Paz, and that's very much in living memory, and that's very much part of the energy behind the fiesta. And I interviewed the preste, the organizer of Gran Poder, in the context of, I was asking him about the fashions and how they relate, how the rise of poietta fashions, which is an item to be worn every day as well as to be worn as costume, how that relates to the fiesta. And I was asking him, well, how do you decide how do people decide which costumes to wear? And he explained immediately, you absolutely have to have the latest designs, the latest music, else people will know immediately and they'll speak bad of you. And the whole point of being preste and organizing the fiesta is to get the prestige and the power and the ability to be the godparents, if you like, the ability to lead, to be community sponsors, that comes with having sponsored one of those fiestas. And the way that he described this, if we go to the next slide, the way that he described that, this is the preste of the fiesta I was just talking about. His name's Johnny Velasquez, and the way he was describing this made it very clear that fashion was very important, like fashion in terms of the sense of newness, the sense of you've got to be up to date. Yeah? And he wasn't saying that in a kind of revindication way, like, because with the presentation, for example, in National Geographic, that this is really about tradition. He was saying this, and of course you've got to have the newness of this. Yeah? And that has a long history as well. That's the wealth has meant that Cholap Senior Fashions have become more spectacular, that they've got more international attention. But there's always been an importance, both in music actually and in fashion, to have the most up-to-date version of things. And I was struck when I was interviewing him, actually. This is a still from the film I made from this project. But I was struck when I was interviewing him of how immediate, and there's a really visceral reaction when you know that something is up to date. And I'm thinking of my own kind of fashion experiences. I grew up in the 80s, so I think that, yes, I have a lot to apologise for probably on the fashion front, but the idea of wearing flares in the 80s, there was a visceral no, like the mullets come to mind as well. Like it must have been theorised psychoanalytically as well, why there's really quite an intimate reaction to your sense of what's up to date. And that's very clearly part of the way that the rise of Cholap Senior Fashions is seen within the Aymara bourgeoisie as well, and that's got a longer history. There are tropes of what the importance of the fiesta and the wealth, the way wealth is distributed within the fiesta, gives that a longer history. Yeah. Can we go to the next slide? And this is the area of La Paz where most of the fashion designers have their studios. And it's exploded over the last 15 years. This is the area that I've stayed in. I've worked in Bolivia since 2006, actually. And this is the area that I've stayed in. I've watched it grow, like just coincidentally. Again, my initial interest was really in urban change in Bolivia. But this particular fashion area has really boomed over this period of time. Eliana Paco Paredes, who's the one who, the fashion designer who showed in New York, had her first studio here, and it's still where it is. And the shopping malls have grown up around it that specialize in the fashion of the Cholap Senior. Now, this is an informal area. You can probably see, like, just by the kind of adobe facades, the way the traffic's going round, the commerce on the street. This is an informal settlement. It's actually seen as quite a dangerous and quite stigmatized area of La Paz. Actually, the area right next to it is called Cementerio, and it's by a cemetery, and also it's a transport hub, and people will be slightly afraid for you if you go there. Unnecessarily, it's stigmatized, but it's not what you quote normally associate with the area that's produced high fashion. I would also say that maybe of the people working in the markets near here, maybe 60% of the women, the majority of the women will be de poietta, and they'll be wearing the poietta as an everyday item as well. Can we have the next slide? This is Elena Pereiras. She's the one who showed in New York, and she's probably the most famous. There are 3 or 4 famous Bolivian Cholap Senior fashion designers there, but she was really at the forefront of it. And she quite clearly, and as an activist, promotes the power of the poietta. And again, thinking about the economic subjectivity that's going along with the rise of these fashions, this is her fashions is to emphasize the elegance of La Cholap Senior, but also because the poietta has become a symbol of empowerment and strength and the fight against discrimination. So that political angle is front and center of her work as well. She's actually just become a candidate for the mass in the municipal elections too. Now, if we can go to, so there's value not only in the clothing, and she makes a real point of using Bolivian textiles as well, which is why her clothes are so expensive. She uses Bolivian textiles rather than imported textiles. But the importance of the elegance and the value that her designs add, like the fact that her name will add value to a design, and the care that she takes in promoting the elegance of what can be seen as quite a utilitarian, certainly in the way it's often presented. It's about the use value of the poietta, but that she really emphasized the elegance of it. Now, in contrast, can we go to the next slide? This is a quote from I gave a presentation on the fashions of La Cholap Senior when I was in I was invited to give a talk to a quite elite group of women in La Paz. I was their coffee morning. I was the entertainment, and that's fine. Like they were very nice to me, and so I gave a presentation on the fashion show that I'd just been to. It was really at the quite early on in my research into this, and I was quite taken aback. They had a debate afterwards about why on earth that I went through how much all the outfits cost. It was very light-hearted. It wasn't an academic presentation, and I was quite taken aback at the debate afterwards about how it couldn't possibly cost that much. Like they were even saying, no, you must be wrong. It couldn't possibly cost that much. And I was quite, the discussion was, you can't have a vicuña shawl that costs $20,000, right? Because the weight of vicuña, like if the material worth of vicuña, it just simply doesn't cost that much per kilo. Therefore, it can't be that expensive. And I thought about Elena Pereiras and how she really emphasizes the elegance of the designs, the importance of her creativity as a designer, and how that was really being erased in this debate. That there were multiple sides to the debate that they were having, so it was kind of it turned into a bit of a focused discussion about value. Yeah? And eventually there was it really went on for about 20 minutes of one woman in particular insisting that no, it's going to be worth what the material is worth. Of course it is. And eventually she said, oh, okay, I see what you mean. It's like when I buy something from Calvin Klein, it's worth more than just the weight of the material. Yeah? And I thought that again showed how, and I was quite taken aback actually. I wasn't expecting that reaction, but reflecting on it afterwards, I thought just how much that shows how political, not only in the explicit aim to empower women de poietta, but how political that this clothing is now being seen as fashion was. Yeah. And it did remind me actually again of work I'd done more on violence and the violence of colonialism. This is a quote from Michael Tausig, who's explaining it's actually from an article about torture, but he's explaining the importance of the cultural meanings that are given to indigenous people, and in particular their relation to nature, to animals, like to the kind of dehumanizing aspect that rendered their labor worthless. And I don't want to be too condemning of the focus group I had there, but that's related to that sense of value, like why we recognize certain things as culture, certain things as fashion, and how that provides value that you can profit from, which raises complicated questions again about what being a commodity means really, and what I'm thinking of Walter Benjamin as well, that kind of jump to being from use value to commercial value, and the symbolism that goes along with that, and the way that certain people are placed in alterity in order to produce that value. And that's what the fashion of the Cholap Senior is disrupting. I'll go to my last slide now. I may have talked a little bit too much, but this is Nagai. She's a young fashion designer who has her studio just opposite the studio of Elena Paredes. That area, again, it has boomed. There are now quite a few young fashion designers who have taken up that trend. Yeah? And I was really struck just from initially quite a simple livelihoods point of view, at the opportunities that this opens up for young people who are working in those informal areas of La Paz. And as Nagai put it, she's tried loads of things to make a living, very typical of people making a living like from in the context of informality, in the context of poverty. You tend to have a portfolio of livelihoods. You try a bit of everything, and she had. Yeah? And then now she's finding that her culture and her social networks are of value in market terms. So she says there, I used to dance myself. So she's tried selling food, she's tried selling used clothes, but with this, the cultural capital, in the word, that she has, and the social capital that she has, can now be translated into a business. And I had a lovely interview with her that, again, is part of the small film I made as part of this project. And it was very clear just how affirmed she felt by being engaged in this enterprise. And that's also what the rise of Cholap Senior Fashions has opened up. I would venture to add that I think that the kind of work that the kind of entrepreneur that Nagai has become, like she's an influencer on Instagram. She's going to have to explain to me what Instagram is. Actually, I'm not up with that, but she's got a real social media presence. She's very successful. Her social networks have also become more professional. I think she might represent a wedding of, she represents a confluence not only of tradition and modernity and the rise of the middle class, but quite a kind of feminine entrepreneurial subject that perhaps isn't predicted even by the decolonial critics of modernity. She's working the market in a way that maybe the mass didn't expect. There's quite a contradiction there between Eva Morales' vision of post-neoliberalism and the fact that the market has really allowed these fashions, a decolonized market has really allowed these fashions to come to the fore. So I think there's a lot to disrupt and transgress there. And I'll just end with one final quote, the final slide. This is from a paper that I found preparing this presentation. My paper came out in 2019, but Angela Janssen has done a lot of work on decolonialism and fashion theory, and that's her from her paper that brings together specifically the work of Walter Mignolo and fashion from the global south. Is modernity's need to learn to become quiet the cacophony of its own narratives, its notions of progress, development, and civilization. And I think the Cholap Senior Fashions and the level of disruption and transgression that represents to the way that we understand the textiles industry, the fashion industry, is fertile ground for that. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. This is very rich and there's a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure that it will generate a lot of discussion as well. And thankfully, you pointed out the connection with your studies and some of your work with Marie as well. So I'm sure that will generate a lot of conversation. So without further ado, again, I would pass the mic to Maria so we can have the second presentation, and then we will look forward to this discussion afterwards. Maria.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides? Because I'm trying to share it. Can you see that? Let me see if I can share that.
It's not yet coming.
Let me see. Seems to be uploading. Let's see. Yes.
Coming now. Yeah, it should be coming now.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Oh, that's absolutely great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Wessie, for organizing this first. Thank you, Louis Ryan, for asking me to do that today. You clearly saw the link between Kate's work and my own research work. And thank you, Kate, because it's been just very informative and great presentation. And I'm very much looking forward to have some discussion with you about empowering women through this cholo and this fashion, etc. in Bolivia. Now, today I want to talk a bit about this book manuscript, which we just, and I say we, and I explain a bit what I mean by we just sent the manuscript for a book, which is on political violence against women in Latin American narrative in 21st century Latin America. This is a manuscript that Professor Stephen Hart from University College London and I have been working on for a while, and we just finished. And when Louis asked me, do you want to present something with Kate, because I can see the connections, I thought, okay, I'm gonna talk about political violence in Latin America through the writing of these women writers in several countries. And then I thought how difficult it is to do a presentation about such a difficult book, which took us for such a long time to do. And I'll explain you why. The title of the book is Gender and Political Violence in 21st Century Latin America. It's coming out in 2022. And it all came after a conversation we had, Stephen and I, in his room actually at UCL. We were talking about how women in Latin America remain silent about the dynamic of violence and abuse led by this machista ideology, which is very much exacerbated in Latin America for many reasons that I'll go through in a minute. So we were talking about it and we thought, yeah, well, because he's been working and writing about this violence and all those dynamics of violence in Latin America, in Cuba and in many other places. And I've been writing about it too with Mexico and Cuba for a while. So we just came to discuss how this violence against women is systemic. This is embedded and in the system. It is perpetuated generation after generation and embedded in this patriarchal culture in the region that everybody's talking about, including academics and feminists and these women writers that, as I'll mention and I'll explain in a minute. So, and then after many months, I came up, I just discovered this report from Amnesty International, just published in March this year. And they clearly, in this report, and there are many other reports, of course, talking about it prior to this, but they were talking very clearly about this institutional and political violence happening in Latin America. They were referring, in this article, they were referring to Mexico, but they were talking about this institutional and political violence against women and how this is operating and this is perpetuated throughout generations, and how this is very obvious now, particularly against women who protest for their rights in Latin America in different settings, but in other environments too. And when we, Stephen and I were talking about institutional and political violence, we just said, how does this political violence operate and how does it manifest in Latin America, and what do we want to write about? Because we just started to think about this book. So, well, this is something which is very clear. Authorities in Latin America, in many countries, they're unable sometimes to guarantee the rule of law. And they themselves, because they're human beings sometimes, they are driven by those stereotypes about women. So they perpetuate and they reproduce them in those protocols. But what I find interesting, and what I found very interesting, is this complicit society, this society which is also part of it, which is also silencing this violence against women, and that society that criminalizes women and these the members of the families, of the victims. Women resent, and that's what we found, the country's legal systems. They look fantastic on paper. If you look into that legal system in Mexico, Argentina, Cuba, and other countries like Chile, Colombia, etc., Bolivia, it looks fantastic on paper, but then when they have to implement those laws, it's just a complete disaster. So that is what those people, those women are resenting. So this is the consent of the government on violent dynamics against women, and we presented that in our book as a form of political violence against women. Now, this is how does it manifest? Why do people, and I'll talk about it in a minute when we talk about these activists, what do they protest against? The impunity of gender violence, forced disappearance, femicide, sexual exploitation, males' physical and psychological aggression to women. They protest against impunity, but it's not only a legal impunity, it is a social impunity over those things. And as I said before, this is a criminalization of the victims, what we in Spanish call re-victimization of the victims and their families. In that conversation, we agreed on something. With activism in Latin American, feminist activism, anti-femicide activism fighting for the gender rights and gender equalities, etc. In Latin America, they're fighting against not a salary gap, they're fighting against the death gap, because they're fighting or they're protesting against the impunity over femicides. These are the collective strategies led by women to protect other women, and this strategy is very visible and very noisy. And they come and protest with all those movements like Ni Una Más, Not One More, that they clearly, openly blame the government. And if you've seen some documentaries and some pictures about them, they clearly blame the government, their systems, for what's happening to women. And they present, in many occasions, women as victims of a system. Except a system that perpetuates, as I said, and the big impunity over that. They present the defense of the women's rights and the fight against gender violence as an issue, human rights issue. Now, why am I saying that? Because in protesting, many risk their own lives. And I'm now, as Kate mentioned before, I'm conducting research about the Mexican frontier, the Mexican border, with Luis Ryan. We are talking about that and bringing it to the center. And we're both very interested in borders. And I can see that how these activists, I've got names of course, the Mexican border, the US-Mexican border is quite an extreme case of this violence, but we can see how those activists, female activists, are risking their own lives, and in many occasions they're killed. And they have to leave the countries, or they have to leave their cities first and then the countries. And we are now organizing in the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center another event on journalists, Mexican journalists who must run away from their country. They've got stories to tell about how risky the professions are. But yes, I need to go back to my idea of Latin America and the Caribbean, because that book is not about Mexico, but it's about the whole Latin America and the Caribbean, or as much as we could cover in a first volume. So these activists, they wanted to give visibility to something that is rootedly ignored and silenced by governments and by other social actors. So these are the noisy ones, the activists that we see and that we follow, and their communication. I was reading the other day an article about how they managed in Latin America to create a system, a movement, and how they inspired other activists in other parts of the world, and how they managed to create those networks and those connections with other organizations, institutions, activists, feminists, academics. They inspired several movements and several trends in academia, and how well they did. And when I say that, I am referring really to the whole Latin America. It all started in Argentina, but now it's quite strong in Mexico and in other countries too. I'm thinking Chile, I'm thinking about other countries and how important and how they've managed to inspire many people and many other activists, and how important what they do is. But what about those women writers who are in a background, at the background? They are not that noisy, although they are, of course, and the selection of writers I did for my part of the book, and also for Stephen, they are very much involved in those activists. You must have been involved in activism if you are, not all of them, but the majority of them are very much involved in activism, anti-femicide activism and social activism. How do they, that's what we wanted to look at, how these women writers who are very popular and famous and everybody's reading their books, and even they're making films out of their books, and they're signing big contracts now, some of them, how do they present, how do they address this form of political violence in their countries? We just selected a number of writers, and that was a very tough process, because sometimes you really need, why this one, and why did they just, the publishing house only allowed us to choose 2 per country, so that was very, very complicated. So what I did is just, in my case, I had correspondence with my chosen ones, and I had several interviews with them, and I was trying to see what made them write and what inspired them, their stories. So they all came with the same idea. They want to invite to rethink, they want to invite the society within their countries and outside the area and the region. They want to invite them to rethink the notions of, rethink from scratch, gender, the subaltern, the other, because in many occasions women are presented as the other, the notion of citizenship, what is to be a woman and be a citizen in certain areas, in certain environments. The female body is also a key element in this literature, the power, male power over female body, and to what extent women can keep the control over the bodies. The body is really, really important. And of course, if we link it to gender violence and femicide and disappearance, then it is a huge topic, a central topic. The state, what is to be a Chilean, Colombian woman, and what is to be a Mexican one, and what means to be a Cuban woman. I think it just stopped being shared. Am I right? Because I stopped looking my.
Yeah, just, well, we didn't
it
see
stopped,
the
yes.
slide.
It has stopped. It just uploading again.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming back now.
Yes, thank you, Wessie. Let me see. Let me just go back to where I was. Was I here? Yeah. The global market, what's the value of women in certain states, what is to live in the border, etc. All those things. So they were inviting people, the reader, that's what they want to do, invite to rethink. And it connects with something Kate mentioned before. This is decolonialism. And they all mention the same, the patriarchy, decolonialism. And something which was really important for all of them is, we want to talk from here, from this region, and we want to tell our stories, and we want to rely in our academics. We don't want to look at Europe or the United States for them to tell us what are the processes we're going to go through to recover the control of our identity and body. We want to rely on our own academics and female writers and stories. So the approach to those stories was between or halfway between the sociological and the literary. So sometimes they looked into and they present, and I can see that they present those stories from outside. This didn't happen to me. But at the same time, sometimes it happens and they tell it as, oh, I've suffered that. I know what I'm talking about because I was brought up there and I know how this operates now. Always in line with women's studies and feminism. The common thesis that all of them do believe that the political violence is a breeding ground for female discrimination, femicide, sexual abuse in a patriarchal environment. So we cannot sit this political violence as something coming from patriarchy only, but this is not coming from those specific problems happening in different areas only. We really need to look at those problems, those specific problems from different areas, from a gender perspective, using the gender perspective. That is very, very important for them. So Stephen and I sat down and we thought, what are the research questions for this book and for this research? What are the things that we want to explore in this book? So I just, I went back to my notes and I rescued them for you today. So we wrote on the afternoon, how do the less visible dynamics of resistance, so see how I'm writing this, resistance. So we don't want to present males versus women, but machista ideology versus non-machista ideology. So these are what we refer to dynamics of resistance to male power, patriarchy and machismo operate in Latin America and the Caribbean. How do the less visible dynamics, how do they do that? What are the mechanisms for resistance they have other than those activists? For example, let's have a look to writers, academics, journalists. How do women writers in particular approach the gender violence in their countries, and why and how gender violence becomes political and institutional violence? This is not that easy to prove. And sometimes when I've talked to some academics from that side, from Latin America, they said, well, if you would actually, yes, I mean, this is sort of political violence, yes, but this comes from society, and I don't quite agree with that. I think that the people who are part of this political and discourse and institutions, etc., they are also part of society. So we can't separate society from politics, because those creating that political discourse are part of society. And I was reviewing the other day some discourse in Mexico about women and the death of women and the killing, my topic of research. And they really create that discourse, which is replicating all those stereotypes coming from, say, from below. So as long as they're replicating and reproducing those ideologies, as they are part of society, they're producing this political and institutional violence. So what does female writers' resistance literature, as some call them, show about the reality on the ground in each of the countries? So what do they tell us about the real reality of their countries? Something that may not happen to appear in those statistics or reports produced by governments. What literary mechanisms and themes women writers use? So what are their topics? So my countries were Cuba, Argentina, and Mexico. So as I said, it took me a while to decide what the two authors I wanted to include in my chapters. So for the Cuban writers, I've conducted quite a lot of research about Cuba. I had very clear in my mind the two writers I wanted. But there are not that many female writers in Cuba compared to Argentina or Mexico. So it was quite simple for me to decide. So what are the three topics, the three main worries or topics, both of them being such a different authors, completely different authors among themselves. What are the three topics that I would say they are both worried about? Very much freedom of expression for women, intellectuals, and racial and sexual minorities under Cuban Revolution. The role of women in the revolutionary history. They are very much worried about this historical memory. We also, as women, we had a role in this revolutionary Fidel Castro's military, very manly revolution. We were there. We help you out, and we also fought with you. Why don't you recognize us? You just left us behind. So that the memory is very important for them. They are trying to rewrite a history, both of them. They are trying to rewrite, they're presenting a different approach to that revolutionary history. And then the gender inequality, of course. With Argentina, the two writers, they very much focused on gender discrimination in something which both of them resented. Argentina as a conservative, competitive, and patriarchal society. Both of them were very critical with their own society. While with the Cuban writers, they were critical with the regime, but not with the society. They loved the society. They didn't have any complaint about the society. But Argentinian writers, they are very critical with society, Argentina society itself. Male control of a woman's body, and particularly the notion of the abortion. They were very worried and concerned about it. And one of them, as I'll show you in a minute, she focused on femicide. So she was very worried about the body and the control, male's control of the body. And two topics which are really important, femicide and the impunity over that. Cuban writers never mentioned anything about femicide. They were not really worried about femicide, the forced, disappeared, sexual abuse, nothing. So Argentina writers are very much worried about it. And as I said before, they're leading the activism against femicide and gender violence, etc. Mexican writers, they are very worried about female body. Again, femicide, and they added something which was very interesting to me, transfemicide, the killing of transgenders and transsexuals. Very worried about it. Again, the female body at the border. The border is per se something to look at separately, and particularly the instrumentalization of women in the global market and the evils of patriarchy and machismo. Now, I'm going to look at the Cuban writers. I am very aware that none of you may know these women and these writers, sorry, their books, etc. So I'm not going to be very extensive on that, but I strongly recommend you to have to make a note of these books, because they are just something else. And I have to say that I recommend them to my students from political violence and in a contemporary context, and also gender and sexuality and human rights and conflicts. I keep on recommending them. And they are students from sociology, criminology. They're not very much used to read in novels. But then they just come back to me. The feedback is just fantastic. So I recommend you to have a look to that, because it will give you a very good idea of the big problems of the country at the minute. I'm very conscious of time, so I've got a bit of time. First, Ana Lucía Portela's 100 Bottles in the World, published in 2010. So she focuses on how women and sexual minorities survive in, as I said, political violence during the 1990s, which was the special period in Cuba, and they went through a lot. So she's very much worried about political, economic, and moral stagnation, how it all determines the lives of Cubans. So she will put the three things, but as I mentioned before, they are not critical with the society at all. She thinks that society is just putting up with what is coming from above, but society's got nothing to, she hasn't got anything to complain about. What is interesting in that book is that she presents Havana as a sort of net, I'd say, that offers women and sexual minorities. That is very interesting with Ana Lucía, because she puts in the same level women and sexual minorities. That offers them, those stigmatized by the system, a space where they can exercise freedom of expression and challenge censorship, political persecution, and institutional homophobia. So Havana is something, it's in a special city where everything that can happen. So it's just very, very good book. Wendy Guerra's Black, that's the title, Black. Again, she focuses on that institutional racism as a form of violence against women in Cuba, and particularly, of course, against young and well-educated Black women in Cuba. So she complains about how the revolutionary system, Fidel Castro's system, perpetuates those mechanisms that limit Black women's access to economic source. Instead of presenting the Havana, she presents the island. She will look at the island itself, the whole Cuba, but not as something that will give you some space to be free and exercise your freedom of expression, etc. But quite the opposite, a claustrophobic place for everybody, and tries to impose gender and sexual norms and cultural traditions to African descendants to the island. But funny enough, she presents something which is really interesting. She doesn't, none of them actually present exile as a solution. Actually, Wendy Guerra in Blacks, she focuses on how racism and how institutional racism also happens in France. So leaving the island is not an option, and it's not going to sort out your life. So you must stay and fight from within, which is something very Cuban anyway. Claudia Pinheiros, she is just one of my favorites, actually. I'm always checking on Amazon if she came up with another book, because she's been a screenwriter, and you can see that when you read her novels, and many of her novels have been taken to now films, etc. But what is interesting with her, she's actually, I think she's the most, she's very compromised with activism, and she's always fighting and going to all those protests, etc. She was a financial advisor many years ago, and she presented a novel she won the award, and then she became a professional writer. So she knows how the system operates. Now she's very much concerned about how women really confront existential dilemmas about the roles of wives and mothers in, and she's very critical with that, a conservative and patriarchal society. She's very concerned about those very strict stereotypes about what is to be a woman, how to behave, etc., particularly in high class. So she problematizes very much the loss of control, women's loss of control over her bodies. Actually, she's very much involved with this law that now allows women to stop pregnancy, etc. She's been very much concerned about it and involved in it. She even talked to the parliament about it. She feels that only women who manage to free herself from those stereotypes can survive the system. And I just selected for you, but I'm not going through that, 3 small stories that she includes in this book, because this book is just a selection of stories. And they have 16, I think, but I just selected 3. And Gran Poder is very shocking, because someone who is living a very nice life finds out that his granddad killed his grandma and buried him in the house. How does it change the mentality of a middle class family? How does it change the whole system? So she likes disturbing and unbalancing the system. Scraps for the Hens tells how a woman who just practiced an abortion to her daughter is going to throw the fetus to the bin. So it's very shocking, and it tells a lot about those social inequalities in Argentina. Selva Almada, strongly recommend her book, strongly recommend her anyway. All her books have been translated to I don't know how many languages, and that is the one who introduced me into the femicide topic, and her book is called Chicas Muertas, Dead Girls. She herself investigates the unresolved femicide of 3 girls in rural Argentina. She goes and investigates that, and through that investigation, actually, I've got that book. It's always around me, the Chicas Muertas. So through that investigation, she tells us how is life for a woman in rural Argentina. The lack of resources, the lack of institutional and political resources to sort out this, the killing, the death of 1 minute. Yeah, 1 minute, Wessie. And so yes, I recommend you the Chicas Muertas. And 2 more slides and I'm finished, which is Mexico. So 1 minute. Lidia Cacho, a writer, journalist, activist. She's been in prison and she's been abused by police for speaking out her voice. And her book, this book, 2018, it's called They Speak, Testimonies of Men Relationship with Their Parents, Machismo and Violence. And it tells the story of males who've suffered abused in the home environment, and how this machismo affects men and change their views of society and women and the treatment of women. And the last one, Fernanda Melchor's Hurricane Season, and you are now buying this, all of you buying this in Amazon, because it's just changed my whole perspective of femicide in rural Mexico. I strongly recommend you. And she looks into transfemicide. Femicide and transfemicide in rural Mexico. And she is very clear when she talks about these crises of violence and security provision, how this is affecting to poor people, working class and poor people in Mexico. A wonderful writer. Final slide. This volume and this selection of writers, just a drop in the ocean. There is a choice and there is opportunity to write a second volume. I felt really frustrated to leave some writers outside, but I'm really happy of the selection we did. So yeah, so I invite you. We will present that at the centre, the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre next year. So we will send invitation around for you to attend. So that's all from me. I just need to stop. And yeah, let me just take that off.
Excellent, thank you, Maria. This is a very rich and engaging seminar, and we only got a minute left. I actually have questions, but certainly I would like to invite Louise to come forth with me. Perhaps we can chair the session together. Well, because we only got very limited time left, so obviously we would like to open questions to the audience first before we selfishly want to ask our own questions. So I'll give it to the floor. Is there anyone who wants to raise your hand? Please do. Burning question, please ask.
There don't seem to be any. Oh, there is a question. Somebody's got their hand up.
Question.
Isaac,
Yes,
would you like
Isaac.
to turn your microphone on and ask your question, Isaac? And we've only got a couple of minutes, so brevity, please.
All right, no. This question is for Kate. Remember, Kate, you were talking about the informal economy in Bolivia. So do you think, like, at a certain point, could the Cholap fashion market could be affected by cheap clothing market? For example, we were saying that China in the informal economy sells a lot and they sell in mass quantities. So do you think it could be affected, or there is this, because even that informal market of China could empower women at a certain point? So that's my question.
That's a really good question. I will be as brief as possible. The informal market is working that global economy in a way that perhaps the vision of the Bolivian government and maybe the formal producers is more to build up Bolivian production. But the reason the informal market, one of the many reasons the informal market has been so successful, is precisely because, well, an overvalued Boliviano has, like currency, has enabled them to import so much textiles from China and South Korea. The guy's business, the last slide I showed, that's mostly textiles from China and South Korea, and that is enabling them. This is quite a pro-consumption globalization position that has enabled them to build businesses. So yes, it's quite complicated, but in a nutshell.
While we're waiting for people to put their hand up, I was going to ask a kind of linking question. I really enjoyed both papers, and I was right. They complemented each other. I spotted that early on, so I'm very pleased that Maria was able to join the session today. But it's really about activism, and it's about the extent to which we see these women, both in Bolivia and the many examples that Maria gave, acting as agents to challenge state institutions. But to what extent does this manifest itself as collective action? Are these women coming together to form organizations and movements as collectivities rather than kind of individual agency? So I know time is very limited, so maybe if you could both briefly respond.
Maria,
Well, this is something which is very collective in Latin America now. And at the city that I'm looking at in the Mexican border, for example, it's very collective and they are very well organized now. They are different in such as sometimes in small cities, relatively small or medium cities. There are several organizations and they are well connected in networks. And as I said, and I mentioned before, they are well connected with academia and they're helping them. And just very briefly, I'll say that in many cases, unfortunately, what we find in these organizations is that they are founded and made by mothers of victims or victims themselves, etc. And in many occasions, they don't have the means and they don't know how to reorganize. But I think that is what's helping them a lot is the feminist activism have joined them. So I'd say this is collective.
That's a really interesting question. I'd say it's collective in two ways in Bolivia. Elena Pereiras, for example, came up through is associated with the MAS as a political party that is, well, it's not political, but it's the political instrument of social movements. So there's her activism is very explicitly connected with social movements. The discourse of the empowerment of women de poietta specifically. There are very strong indigenous women's social movements in Bolivia. One's called Las Batolinas, for example, and that's based on a historical figure who was de poietta and a powerful warrior. But there's a second way in which they're collected as well, and that's as part of a community economy. The accusation against the rise of the middle class, the indigenous bourgeoisie and the wealth of the indigenous bourgeoisie, the accusation that I've heard quite frequently expressed from the mainstream, if you like, the traditional middle class, is that there's all this talk about community economies in El Alto and the importance of reciprocity and cooperation, but then they get rich and it's all about individual consumption and stuff like that. And I think they're getting that a bit wrong. And I've heard other anthropologists say similar things. The Preste from the Fiesta illustrated that well, is that you want to show your wealth to remain in that community. And there's some work about how that tradition of compadrazgo, becoming the godfather or the godmother, and typically it's as a couple, like that's it's a little bit naive, I think, but that's a redistribution mechanism. Like that's a way to redistribute wealth into the community. But they're still very much of the community. It's not that they've got rich and wandered off to Miami or whatever else. It's a community economy that's behind it, I would say. No.
Right. I wonder whether there's any more questions on the floor. I know that we're already 5 minutes behind, so we nearly need to close, although I very much like to ask my questions of disruption. I know somehow, Kate, in your presentation, you mentioned that, well, I mean, your example demonstrates so much about these kind of disruptive moments of a lot of concepts, as well as the reality as well, like looking at like decolonization, and also the closing line is about these address of modernity. So I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, Maria's presentation also illustrates most of these disruptions that has been caused and generated by these women's writer. But what exactly are they? That's actually my question. I know that it might be a longer answer, and I wonder whether you can summarize and in a few words. I mean, what for someone in Kate, I was thinking about whether, well, in Bolivia, is there any kind of sort of fashion which is coming from New America, the kind of like the formal market, the luxury market or high street or whatsoever, and to what extent these sort of informal markets actually disrupt the hierarchy, the social hierarchy, and the running or the operations of these other types of mainstream market. So that's the kind of thing, and certainly for Maria is the aspects of the extent to which that these women's writer are disrupting the sort of traditional sort of writing markets or the publication markets, and that's my sort of question that I would lead to.
A really interesting question. I think that the main disruption actually is aesthetic. It's on ideals of beauty, and that that question of what counts as up to date, what counts as now, what counts as, and the idea that an outfit that it's very difficult to describe the poietta without reference to tradition, without reference to post-colonial history. You can't describe it without kind of falling into that. Well, you know, I in this context can't describe it without falling into that. And the images that are coming through of that I can't see as an outsider to Bolivia, I can't see it as fashion, I'll confess. But it's framed as fashion, and it is seen as fashion in the context that has now become hegemonic. Actually, has now become dominant. And I think that the reversal of the ideals of beauty and the way that it's almost the visceral reaction that you get when you know something's up to date, or it's quite an intimate sense of what's up to date. I think that's the most disruptive element. If I express that right, I think that's the fact that it's seen as fashion, I think, is the most disruptive. And that affects value, and that is disruptive for the market. In terms of the formal markets that are coming, I mean, the elite women I was talking to, for example, they'll have bought their Calvin Klein in the US or Spain. Like, you can access that in Bolivia, but it's that's where they. You can access that in Bolivia, but you know, it's quite limited, the provision there. And there are the disruption from the informal economy. It's not really quite right to think of it, I think, as the informal disrupting the formal. It's simply that the formal isn't particularly developed there. Popular people are dominant. And then again, after the decimation of Bolivian national production in the 1980s, the economy really isn't there to be disrupted. So it's the wrong framing for it, and that in itself is a disruption. I think the fact that the informal economy, basically, again, it's the norm. That's the point of reference, and then is that.
Yeah, good. I mean, well, that certainly, we could carry on with this conversation, because obviously, well, there are many aspects of disruption, as you can tell, that, well, the aesthetic, the operations, notions of fashions, modernities, and decolonizations, and all the rest of it. I think, well, we need another hour just to lay them all down. But yeah, you're right that the notion of fashion is particularly kind of in sync with, and also changing the roles of like gatekeepers who could legitimize fashion, and that's also another aspect of it. But yeah, thank you. Maria, you want to add on
for
something?
Yeah, well, just very briefly, they are disrupting the publishing market in many aspects. Just to mention too, because of the time we have, they are telling the story of those who've been silenced for many years and many generations, and this is causing a lot of interest in the publishing market. People are not interested, editors are not interested in listening more about for example, I'm thinking about Cuba. They are not interested in Buena Vista Social Club, or very nice and sweet approach to Cuba. They want to hear the stories of homosexuals, women, lesbians, transsexuals. The same with Mexico. They don't want to hear the story of these narcos, etc. They want to hear, they want to know about the stories of femicides. And of course, this is very much linked to the notions of feminist activism. And because of the boom of feminist activism in the whole Latin America, it's got repercussions in the publishing world, in the publishing market. So they are breaking the whole market, and they're bringing new stories that, if I have to summarize in just one sentence, they are telling the stories of the invisibles, of those who've not been listened to for many generations, many years. So yes, they are very disruptive. And actually, if you can just add a sentence, they are showing this view, which is completely decolonized from what we know here in Europe. But at the same time, it's very localized in there. They want to hear very specific stories of people told by people who've been living there, who know what they're talking about. Very specific. So yes, they're breaking the market, and they're very successful, and I'm very happy for them. Yeah.
We look forward to read the book. Well, it's probably going to be very rich, and also there's a lot of thought-provoking ideas into it. So it's great. Louise, do you have anything to add?
Well, I just wanted to thank the two speakers and thank everybody for coming today. And also to say, as Maria had flagged, that we will be revisiting this topic in the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre on the 16th of June. So if this is a topic that interests you, please register and come along to our event then on the 16th of June, where you can hear some Mexican journalists speaking about their experiences. I think it'll be a very powerful event. So thank you very much, Wessie, for inviting us to this joint event between the two research centres.
Yeah, well, I also want to thank all the speakers. It is really engaging. I'm sure that if we have another hour, we can go on for another hour as well. I've actually just spotted one more hand. I do not know to what extent that we could stay more, but if it is a very quick question, then we take
I've actually got to go. Sorry, I'm actually supposed to be in another meeting right now that started at 7. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Louise.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. If the other two, if Maria and Kate is okay, then we can take this one last question, shall we? Yeah, Maria, please, short your question.
Oh, am I saying my question?
Yes,
you can hear
yes,
me?
please.
Okay. I was wondering where I can get more information about your the presentation, the talk about the Mexican journalists.
Oh, I can answer that. You need to go to the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center website, which is London Met. Did you get that, Maria?
That's very long.
Yes, Global Diversities.
Okay.
Global Diversities, or you can do something. Well, yes, I'm going to tell you the name. Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center.
Yes, that came up right away.
Yes, and then you will find details about the events that we're prepping for the end of this academic year, which is never gonna finish, let's face it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. I think that's the perfect way to wind up our session. And I really want to thank both of the speakers. This is absolutely great and engaging. And well, we should actually schedule it for 2 hours, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. But I'm sure that, well, these discussion would carry on beyond the session. So I will call you back up for a cup of tea or a glass of wine so we can carry on with the conversation. And so I'd also want to thank all the audience staying with us. Well, we are very unprofessional today that we kind of let it go, but just because it was so interesting that we can't let these speakers leave early. So thank you for joining us and also staying behind. We at Creature also want to say that, well, this is also the second seminar of our research series called Reorienting Cultural Creativity. And we have another seminar coming up next Thursday. We brought together Dr. Christine Chisesky from the Victoria and Albert Museum, Amanda Pinav from Sidalish Museum in Amsterdam, and also our colleague Dr. Harriet McKay and myself for dialogue in collecting and re-representing global culture in museum. So now this would be the Thursday next week at 4 to 6 p.m. So that is already on our Creature website, where you can find the link and go on for the registration. So I hope that we can see many of you here. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for two speakers. I'll be getting in touch with you separately and to carry on with our exciting conversation. So
Thank you, Wessie. Thank you for organizing it.
No worries, yeah. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, we should
you.
catch up. Yeah, I have to catch you as well, Kate. Thank you. Okay, bye for